The human joked, "Marry me if I win." The alien queen said, "Prepare the ceremony." The heat of two suns beat down on the arena floor, baking the blood-darkened sand until the air itself seemed to shimmer with thirst. Clyde tasted copper and grit, his lungs burning with every ragged breath. Across from him, the thing nicknamed the Crusher by the roaring Valorex crowd raised its four massive arms, two fists brandishing serrated bone clubs, and bellowed its triumph. It was a wall of muscle and gray-green hide, and Clyde was the last obstacle it had to flatten before claiming victory in the Grand Rites preliminary trial. He was out of tricks, his body a map of deep bruises and shallow cuts, his stolen blade lying snapped 10 feet away. Survival had taught him that when strength failed, audacity was the only weapon left. His gaze lifted past the hulking brute, traveling up the tiers of roaring aliens to the silent shadow of the royal box. There she sat, Queen Hersilia, a slash of imperial crimson and midnight black hair against the pale stone of her throne. Her face, a masterpiece of regal indifference, betrayed nothing. Her dark eyes watched the slaughter with the placid attention one might give a theatrical performance. In that moment, with the roar of the crowd of physical pressure and the shadow of death looming over him, a wild, desperate humor seized him. "You want a show?" Clyde yelled, his voice raw but carrying in a sudden lull as the Crusher postured for the crowd. He directed his words not to the beast, but to the throne. "Is this all for your entertainment, Your Majesty?" The Crusher paused, confused by the shift in focus. The crowd's roar softened to a murmur. Clyde took another heaving breath, a bloody grin splitting his face. "Grant me freedom if I survive this beast. Hell, marry me if I win the whole grand rite." Absolute silence fell over the grand arena. It was so sudden and so complete that the whistle of the wind across the sand was the only sound. The Crusher stood motionless, its brutish mind unable to process the sacrilege. Every Valorex, from the lowest pit vendor to the highest noble, stared, their collective shock a palpable force. Then, Queen Hersilia moved. She rose from her obsidian throne, a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye. She was taller than he had realized, a column of terrifying grace. When she spoke, her voice needed no amplification. It was calm, clear, and carried the weight of law. "Human," she declared, the word itself an indictment and a curiosity. "By the ancient covenant of the rite, any vow made on the sacred sand is binding if accepted by the throne. If you are crowned champion, I will hold you to that vow." She paused, letting the words sink into the stunned arena. "Prepare the ceremony." The shockwave of her proclamation was more powerful than any physical blow. Clyde felt his own heart hammer against his ribs, his reckless joke twisting into a horrifying, ironclad reality. The Crusher, finally spurred to action by the perceived insult, charged forward with a guttural roar. But the beast's focus was broken, its rage made clumsy. Clyde saw it in its eyes. And in that moment of distraction, he found his opening. He dodged the wild swing of a club, ducked under a grasping arm, and kicked a loose pile of sand and sharp gravel directly into the creature's lower set of eyes. The Crusher roared in pain, flailing blindly. It was all the time Clyde needed. He lunged for the discarded hilt of his broken sword, jammed the jagged shard of metal into the unarmored joint behind the Valorax's knee, and threw all his weight against it. The giant staggered, its leg buckling with a wet crunch, and crashed to the arena floor in a heap of stunned muscle. Clyde stood over it, gasping for air, the broken hilt still in his hand, as the arena announcer, his voice trembling with disbelief, declared him the victor. He looked back to the throne. The Queen's expression was unchanged, but he saw it, the barest flicker of something new in her dark, fathomless eyes. Interest. The cell was cold stone and sterile functionality. A medic drone had sealed his cuts with a stinging sealant and left him with a protein paste that tasted like chalk. Clyde was replaying the Queen's words in his mind for the 100th time when the cell door hissed open. A Valarax stood there, his crimson skin weathered, his scales touched with gray at the temples. He was clad in the black and gold of the royal guard, his posture as unyielding as the palace walls. He was the head royal guard, a figure Clyde had seen constantly at the Queen's side. The guard's gaze was heavy with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. He gestured with his chin. The Queen will see you. The walk through the palace was a lesson in Valarax culture. Halls wide enough to march an army through were lined with massive, brutalist sculptures and display cases holding weapons that looked more like instruments of geological disruption than tools for combat. There was no art for art's sake, only the glorification of power and conquest. The head royal guard led him to a set of immense obsidian doors, which slid open to reveal a private audience chamber. Hersilia was seated on a simple, elevated chair that was less a throne and more a seat of judgment. Up close, her presence was overwhelming. The vibrant crimson of her skin seemed to absorb the light. Her long, black hair was held back by a simple circlet of gold, revealing the elegant sweep of her pointed ears. She waved a hand, and the head royal guard bowed stiffly before retreating, the doors closing with a heavy thud behind him. They were alone. "You fight with no honor," she said. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. "Honor doesn't patch your guts back in when a four-armed monster tries to pull you apart," Clyde retorted, his voice raspy. He remained standing in the center of the room, a deliberate refusal to show deference. A faint, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in her jaw. "Honor is the foundation of our empire. It is the law that separates us from beasts." "My species has a saying," Clyde said, shifting his weight. "There are no laws in the jungle. Your arena is the biggest jungle I've ever seen." Her dark eyes narrowed, studying him not as a captive, but as a puzzle. "Your vow was an insult to the throne and the sanctity of the right." "It was a joke," he shot back, "made by a man who was about to die. My species does that sometimes. You might want to get a cultural advisor before you start planning any weddings." "I do not require an advisor to interpret a binding oath," she replied, her voice dropping, taking on a dangerous, silken quality. "You stand on my world, under my laws. Your desperation is your own concern. Your words are now mine." The sheer, unbending certainty of her stunned him into silence. He saw now that there was no room for negotiation. In her mind, the matter was settled. He was a piece on a game board, and she had just made her move. He watched her, truly watched her, and saw past the imperious queen. He saw the faint lines of stress around her eyes, the rigid control in her posture. This was a woman carrying a weight he couldn't possibly comprehend. An unwelcome flicker of empathy sparked within him. She was magnificent, yes, but she was also trapped inside her own traditions. And now, thanks to his stupid mouth, so was he. "Dismissed," she said, turning her head slightly, a clear signal that the audience was over. He turned and walked away, the weight of her gaze on his back feeling more substantial than any chain. The encounter left a charge in the air, a strange, unsettling energy that followed him all the way back to his cold stone cell. The next trial was a staged massacre. The arena announcer's booming voice declared it would be a team melee in the Gorge of Shadows, a hazardous, rocky environment filled with treacherous drops and pockets of noxious gas. The teams were announced. Clyde found himself rostered with a collection of disgraced criminals and political prisoners. It was a death sentence, and he knew who had signed it. During the first trial, he'd noticed another contender watching from a privileged seating area near the Queen. a handsome, powerfully built Valerax noble whose sneer was a permanent fixture on his face. He later learned this was Lord Vorlag, a suitor for the queen's hand and the right's clear favorite. Before he was herded toward the transport that would take him to the gorge, the head royal guard appeared again. "The queen requires your presence." This time, the summons felt different. He was led to a smaller, more intimate chamber, a private armory of sorts, where Hersilia stood before a display of exquisite ceremonial weapons. She turned as he entered, holding a vambrace made of a dull black metal etched with fine obsidian lines. A contender who has passed the first trial is permitted a token from the throne, she announced, her tone formal, a symbol of their progress. She approached him. He stood his ground, his heart rate quickening. The air around her seemed to shimmer with her power, and she smelled of something clean and alien, like rain on hot stone. She took his left arm, her crimson fingers surprisingly warm against his skin. The touch was light, professional, yet it sent a cascade of fire through his veins. He watched her face as she fastened the heavy vambrace to her forearm. Her expression was focused, her long lashes brushing against her high cheekbones. For a heartbeat, the chamber, the rite, the danger, it all faded away, leaving only the profound, shocking intimacy of her touch. "The patterns are from the founding dynasty," she murmured, her voice low, meant only for him. "Wear it as a reminder of the legacy you now fight to be a part of." The vambrace clicked shut. She released him, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second too long. He looked down at the gift, then back at her. Her face was once again an impassive mask, but her eyes held a depth he couldn't decipher. Was this a genuine favor? A warning, or some kind of cruel joke? He wouldn't get his answer until he was deep in the gorge of shadows with Vorlag's hunters closing in and his back against the wall. It was then, fumbling with the vambrace in desperation, that he found the hidden seam. A flick of his thumb, and a 6-inch blade, impossibly thin and dark as a sliver of night, slid silently from the casing. It was a monomolecular blade, an assassin's tool, strictly forbidden in any honorable combat. It was the most dishonorable gift he had ever received, and it was the only thing that might keep him alive. The Gorge of Shadows was a death trap. Vorlag's hand-picked team of champions hunted Clyde's group of outcasts with brutal efficiency. 2 of his teammates were dead within the first hour. The others were terrified, ready to give up. Clyde knew that Valerax warriors, for all their strength, are creatures of honor and direct confrontation. They were predators, not survivors. He, on the other hand, had been a survivor his whole life. "They expect us to fight," he hissed to his remaining 3 teammates, huddled behind a cluster of crystalline rock formations. "They expect us to stand and die honorably. We're not going to." He laid out a plan, one based on evasion, traps, and misdirection. He taught them how to use the terrain, how to create rock slides, how to use the pockets of disorienting gas as cover. It was guerrilla warfare, a concept so foreign to the Valerax that it was almost magical. For hours, they were ghosts in the gorge, whittling down their superior opponents one by one through cunning rather than combat. The final confrontation happened on a narrow rope bridge spanning a chasm of unknown depth. The enemy team's leader, a hulking champion second only to Vorlag, had them cornered. As the champion charged, Clyde activated the hidden blade in his vambrace. His teammates gasped, recognizing the forbidden weapon. But instead of meeting the Valerax's charge, Clyde lunged for the thick anchor ropes of the bridge. With 2 swift, silent cuts, the monomolecular blade severed the thick cables. The bridge gave way with a tremendous groan, dropping the charging champion and his last remaining warrior into the misty depths below. Victory. Later, in the grime and sweat of the contestants' armory, Clyde felt a presence behind him. Lord Vorlag stood there, flanked by 2 of his retainers. His handsome face was twisted in a condescending smile. Clever tricks, human, Vorlag said, his voice a low sneer. But tricks are for insects, not warriors. Clyde turned slowly, every muscle in his body aching. Last I checked, the insect was the one still standing. Vorlog's smile tightened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Let me tell you a story about honor. The queen's father, King Valerius, was the greatest champion of his generation, undefeated in the right. Yet in his final duel, he fell to my father, a man of lesser strength but greater vision. Clyde stood motionless, the meaning hanging heavy in the air. My father's blade was coated with a nerve poison from the outer systems, untraceable. One small cut was all it took. The great king died not from a fatal blow, but from a failure of his own body, a deeply dishonorable end, recorded in the archives as a simple, honorable defeat. Vorlag leaned in, his breath hot and foul. The right is not about honor. It is a tool for those who understand true power. The queen is a sentimental fool, clinging to her father's fairy tales. She will learn the truth soon enough, and you, human, will have a similarly tragic, honorable accident. I promise you. The blood in Clyde's veins turned to ice. This wasn't a contest anymore. It was an execution, and he was the only one who didn't know the schedule. The summons came at dawn. Clyde was taken not to an audience chamber, but to the apex of the royal spire, a circular room whose walls were a seamless view of the star-dusted cosmos. In the center of the room, a holographic map of the Valerax Empire pulsed with soft light. Hersilia stood before it, her back to him. She did not turn when he entered. Lord Vorlog paid you a visit last night, she stated. It wasn't a question. Clyde's mind raced. This was a test. If he kept Vorlag's secret, he was a pawn. If he revealed it, he was an informant. Either way, he was a dead man. He decided on a third option, the truth. He told me how his father killed yours, Clyde said, his voice flat. And he promised me the same. The holographic stars reflected in her dark eyes as she slowly turned to face him. He saw it then, for the first time. The perfect, regal mask of the queen cracked, and for a single, breathtaking second, he saw the woman beneath. He saw a flash of ancient pain, of rage held in check for years, of a profound and suffocating loneliness. The mask slammed back into place almost instantly, but he had seen it. He is protected by the Elder Council, she said, her voice tight with suppressed fury. They are all of his father's generation. They value the stability his house provides over the justice my father is owed. They allow him to mock me with his presence, to court me for the throne he intends to steal, just as his father did. She took a step toward him, her crimson hands clenched into fists at her sides. I accepted your vow for 2 reasons, human. The first was your audacity. It was a novel distraction. The second was a calculated risk. A consort chosen by the right, but from outside our political system, would be bound only to me, an ally immune to the rot in my own court. She searched his face, her gaze intense. I did not expect Vorlog to be so brazen. I have put you in a position where you cannot possibly survive. In that moment of shared, dangerous truth, the entire dynamic between them shifted. The vast gulf of queen and captive, of alien and human, vanished, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. They were 2 people trapped in the same gilded cage, facing the same enemy. He found himself taking a step toward her, an unconscious gesture of solidarity. So what do we do? The we hum in the air between them, a word more powerful than any vow. Hersilia looked down at his arm, at the black vambrace she had given him. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over it, her fingers wrapping around his forearm. The contact was no longer the formal gesture of a queen, but the desperate, affirming touch of an ally. She searched his face, her gaze intense. I did not expect Vorlog to be so brazen. I have put you in a position where you cannot possibly survive. In that moment of shared, dangerous truth, the entire dynamic between them shifted. The vast gulf of queen and captive, of alien and human, vanished, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. They were two people trapped in the same gilded cage, facing the same enemy. He found himself taking a step toward her, an unconscious gesture of solidarity. So what do we do? The we hung in the air between them, a word more powerful than any vow. Hersilia looked down at his arm, at the black vambrace she had given him. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over it, her fingers wrapping around his forearm. The contact was no longer the formal gesture of a queen, but the desperate, affirming touch of an ally. "We survive," she whispered, her voice a low fire. "I will teach you how to fight like a Valerax, and you will teach me how this game is won by a man with no honor." The royal gymnasium was a cavernous space of polished floors and menacing-looking training equipment. This became their sanctuary, their conspiracy room. Hersilia declared she was personally tutoring Clyde in the Vakesh, the Valerax martial art, a privilege unheard of for an off-worlder. To the court, it was a queen taking a personal interest in her potential consort. To them, it was a nightly ritual of escalating intimacy disguised as combat. "Your center of gravity is too high," she commanded, her voice echoing in the empty hall. "You fight like a scarecrow." She moved behind him, her body pressing against his back as she adjusted his stance. The heat of her was a tangible thing, seeping through his thin training tunic. Her hands were on his hips, strong and sure, guiding him into a lower, more stable position. He could feel the solid muscle of her thighs against his, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. The scent of her, that clean, rain-on-hot stone fragrance, filled his senses. "The Valerax fight from the ground up," she explained, her lips close to his ear, her breath a warm caress. "Power comes from the earth. Feel it." Their sessions were a blur of sweat and strained muscles. Sparring became a dance. She taught him how to block, to parry, to find the weaknesses in Valerax anatomy, the nerve cluster beneath the jaw, the vulnerable joint where the upper and lower arms met. Every lesson was a study in physical contact. Her hands would guide his, tracing the lines of her own body to show him a pressure point, her fingers leaving trails of fire on his skin. He, in turn, learned the unique feel of her, the surprising smoothness of her crimson skin, the unyielding strength in her limbs, the way her black hair would whip around and brush his face when she executed a particularly fast spin. One night, he finally managed to gain the upper hand. He used a human feint she'd never seen, a move born of back alley brawls, and swept her legs out from under her. He caught her before she hit the floor, his arm wrapped around her waist, their bodies flush against each other, chests heaving. They were frozen for a long moment, tangled together, his face inches from hers. Her dark eyes, wide with surprise, stared into his. The pretense of student and teacher evaporated, leaving only a man and a woman, breathless and close. "You learn quickly," she murmured, her voice husky. "I have a good teacher," he replied, his own voice low. She did not pull away, neither did he. In the silence of the gymnasium, with only the sound of their own breathing between them, a new lesson began, one that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the magnetic, irresistible pull that was growing between them. The morning of the semi-final duel, the head royal guard approached Clyde not with a summons, but with a simple water flask. The old Valerax's expression was as stoic as ever, but his eyes held a new light, something akin to respect. "The queen ordered your rations be drawn from her personal stores," the guard said gruffly. "The flask you were issued was compromised." He tapped the container in his hand. "This one is clean." He said nothing more, but the message was a thunderclap. Vorlog had tried to poison him. Hersilia had anticipated it and protected him. The conspiracy was real,
and so was her commitment to their alliance. His opponent was a lithe, whip-fast warrior from Vorlog's own house, known for his speed and dual-wielding daggers. In the arena, Clyde felt a new confidence. The lessons in the gymnasium were more than just physical. They were a transfer of knowledge, of spirit. He moved differently now, his stance lower, his movements flowing with a grace he didn't know he possessed. He met the assassin's blindingly fast strikes, not with equal speed, but with the calm, methodical blocks and parries Hersilia had drilled into him. He saw the fight through her eyes, anticipating the Valorac's patterns, the predictable lunges, the tells of a coming strike. Then he broke the pattern. He introduced human chaos into the Valorac's equation. He feinted high and kicked low. He used his opponent's momentum against him, sending the assassin stumbling. The crowd murmured, confused by his unorthodox style. It was a blend of two worlds, of Valorac's discipline and human improvisation. The end came swiftly. The assassin overcommitted to a spinning strike, and Clyde was ready. He didn't try to block it. Instead, he stepped inside the spin, just as Hersilia had taught him, and drove the heel of his palm into the nerve cluster below his opponent's jaw. The warrior seized up, daggers clattering to the sand, and collapsed in a temporarily paralyzed heap. The arena announcer declared his victory, his voice laced with awe. The crowd, after a moment of stunned silence, erupted into a roar of approval. They had witnessed something new. Amid the noise, Clyde's eyes found Hersilia in the royal box. She was leaning forward slightly, a look of fierce pride on her face. He ignored the roaring crowd, ignored his defeated opponent, and offered her a deep, formal bow. It was a gesture of a knight to his queen, a public declaration of fealty. In the stands, Lord Vorlog's face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. The night before the final battle was unnaturally still. A heavy, expectant silence had fallen over the palace. Clyde sat on the edge of the simple cot in his chambers, sharpening a blade he knew he couldn't trust, when his door slid open without a sound. It was Hersilia. She wore no crown, no regal finery, only a simple, dark tunic that fell to her ankles. She dismissed the guard with a silent wave of her hand. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken words. The pretenses were gone. She was not his queen, and he was not her champion. They were simply a man and a woman on the eve of a battle that could claim one or both of them. "You are ready," she said, though it sounded more like a question, a plea for reassurance. "You taught me well," he replied, setting the whetstone aside. He stood, and she was closer than he expected. He could see the faint, dark patterns on her crimson skin, like subtle markings on a jungle cat. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the line of a fresh scar on his cheek. "You have earned so many of these in my name." Her voice was a whisper of sound, filled with a sorrow that cut him deeper than any blade. "They're just a part of the story," he said, his own voice growing thick. He found his own hand rising, moving with a will of its own to gently cup her face. Her skin was warm, alive. His thumb brushed over her high cheekbone. "What about yours? You wear yours on the inside, don't you?" A single tear, dark as wine, welled in her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It was the most profound expression of vulnerability he had ever witnessed. He leaned in and gently wiped it away with his thumb. "My people have no concept for this," she whispered, her gaze fixed on his lips. "Physical contact is about dominance, submission, the transfer of strength. Not this, not tenderness." "Let me show you," he murmured. He closed the small distance between them and pressed his lips to hers. It was a soft, searching kiss. At first, she was completely still, a beautiful statue in his arms. Then he felt a slight tremor run through her. A small, questioning sound escaped her throat, and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. The kiss deepened, becoming something more, a frantic, desperate exchange of fear and hope, of loneliness and discovery. It was an act of pure intimacy, a human gesture that communicated more than words ever could. It was a revelation, a collision of two souls in the quiet dark, and a promise that no matter what happened when the suns rose, they would not face it alone. The grand arena was a living entity, a beast made of 50,000 roaring Valaracs, all hungry for a final bloody spectacle. Lord Vorlog stood across the sand, a vision of arrogant perfection in his polished black armor. He raised his serrated power sword in a salute to the crowd, who roared their adoration. He was their hero, their tradition, their champion. Clyde was the anomaly, the outsider. The signal was given. The duel began. Vorlog was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his blade a blur of silver. Clyde was pure defense, his movements economical, conserving every ounce of energy as he parried the storm of blows. He was using the techniques Hersilia had taught him, weathering the assault, waiting for his moment. The moment came, but not as he expected. Vorlog feinted, and in the split second Clyde took to adjust, the tip of the power sword sliced a shallow cut across his ribs. It was not deep, but it was enough. Clyde felt a cold numbness spread from the wound, a leaden weight dragging at his limbs. The neurotoxin. It was fast. His movements grew sluggish. His vision began to tunnel, the roaring of the crowd fading to a distant hum. Vorlog saw it, his lips curling into a triumphant snarl. He pressed his attack, forcing a weakening Clyde back step by step. Through the haze of the poison, Clyde could just make out Hersilia in the royal box. She was on her feet, her hands gripping the stone balustrade, her regal composure shattered by raw, naked fear. Her fear was a jolt to his dying system. He remembered a lecture from his military days, a biologist explaining the raw power of the human adrenal gland, the fight-or-flight response that could grant moments of impossible strength. He focused his will, his entire being, on the image of Hersilia's terrified face. He thought of Vorlog stealing her throne, of her father's fate becoming hers. Rage, pure and primal, flooded him. He felt it then, a chemical explosion in his core. His heart hammered like a drum, and a surge of fire burned the poison's fog from his mind. It was a desperate, self-destructive act, burning his body's final reserves, but it gave him a few precious seconds of absolute clarity. Vorlog lunged, expecting an easy kill, but Clyde met him with a burst of speed the Valaracs couldn't comprehend. He didn't block the sword. He moved inside its arc, slamming his shoulder into Vorlog's chest. The bigger warrior stumbled back, surprised. Clyde used the momentum, hooking his leg behind Vorlog and using the last of his adrenaline-fueled strength. It was the sweep Hersilia had drilled into him for hours. Vorlog crashed backward, his leg twisting under him at an unnatural angle. A sickening crack echoed in the momentary silence. Vorlog screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, clutching his shattered leg. Clyde stood over him, swaying on his feet, his borrowed time running out. He had won. He was the champion. He held his head high for one single triumphant moment, his eyes finding Hersilia's, before the world went black and he fell face first into the sand. He awoke to the scent of unfamiliar herbs and the unreal softness of silk. The throbbing pain in his side had been replaced by a dull, healing ache. He wasn't in the infirmary. The chamber was opulent, the ceiling a high, vaulted dome painted with constellations. He was in the queen's bed. Hersilia sat in a chair by his side, watching him. The desperate fear he had last seen on her face was gone, replaced by a profound and quiet relief. Her usual regal bearing was softened, her hair unbound and cascading over the shoulders of a simple silk robe. "The antidote is working," she said, her voice low and soft. The royal physicians were quite impressed by your body's violent reaction to the toxin. They said the chemical surge in your system kept you alive long enough for them to counteract it. He managed a weak smile. Humanity. Yeah.
A ghost of a smile touched her own lips. Indeed. She grew more serious. Vorlog confessed. Under interrogation, he revealed everything. His conspiracy, the network of nobles loyal to his house, the plan to assassinate me after the rite. The council is in chaos. My enemies have been exposed. My throne is secure. She reached out, her crimson hand cool as she gently brushed the hair from his forehead. You gave me my kingdom, Clyde. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It felt natural, right?
You taught me how to win it.
They stayed like that in a comfortable silence, the weight of the last few weeks settling around them. The arena, the politics, the poison, it was all over. All that remained was the truth of the two of them, alone in the quiet of her chambers. My champion, she said finally, her grip on his hand tightening. Her dark eyes held his, and in their depths he saw his future. The priests are making ready. A vow was made before our people. He didn't need to ask if it was still her will. He already knew the answer. He simply nodded. Later, he stood on the great palace balcony, not as a captive, but as a consort. He was dressed in ceremonial silks of black and gold that felt strange against his skin. Beside him, Hersilia, adorned in her full regalia, looked every inch the powerful monarch she was. She took his hand and held it up for the thronging crowd below to see. A roar of approval, louder and more genuine than any he had heard in the arena, shook the very foundations of the palace. He looked at her, at the magnificent alien queen who had accepted a dying human's joke, and saw the small, secret smile that was meant only for him. His life had been forfeit in the dust of the arena, and he had flippantly wagered the only thing he had left. He had never expected to win, and he certainly had never expected the prize to be a universe. 6 months later, the grand arena stood silent, a hollowed-out monument to a tradition that was already beginning to feel archaic. The real power in the Valerix Empire had shifted from the bloody sands to the quiet, star-dusted sanctuary of the Royal Strategium. Clyde stood leaning against the archway of the chamber, watching his wife. Hersilia, queen of the Valerix, empress of a dozen systems, was hunched over a holographic display, her brow furrowed in concentration as she manipulating intersecting fields of trade law and military logistics. A simple golden circlet was the only crown she wore, her long black hair tied back in a practical braid. He no longer saw the intimidating monarch who had accepted his death row jest. He saw the woman who argued with him over the proper spice-to-meat ratio in his attempts at cooking, the partner who would fall asleep with her head on his shoulder while they reviewed stellar cartography charts, the fierce protector of her people who now understood that strength had more than one definition. He walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders and kneading the tense muscles there. She let out a soft sigh, leaning back against his chest without taking her eyes off the display. The mining guilds on Xylos are threatening to strike, she murmured, her crimson fingers resizing a data block. Councilman Varel insists I send a legion to restore order. He says any negotiation will be seen as weakness. Councilman Varel was the new elder councilman, a traditionalist fossil who saw every problem as a nail for his military hammer. He was the most vocal of the old guard who found the human consorts distasteful. "And what does the Queen say?" Clyde asked, his voice low in her ear. "The Queen says that a dead miner produces no ore," Hersilia replied, a hint of weariness in her tone. "And that Varel's idea of order looks a lot like a graveyard." "Smart woman, that Queen," Clyde said, pressing a light kiss to the delicate point of her ear. "So, what if we offer the guilds a new contract? Give them a stake in the profits, a percentage of the refined metals.
improve their housing and medical facilities, make them partners instead of subjects. Hersilia tilted her head, a familiar motion he knew meant she was intrigued. The council would call it a handout. They would say we are rewarding insolence. Call it a strategic investment in infrastructure. The Valerics understand investment. He countered, we're not giving them money, we're giving them a reason to be loyal, a reason to work harder. It's cheaper than a legion, and the returns will be 100 times greater. It's not weakness, it's pragmatism. She was silent for a long moment. Then her fingers flew across the holographic interface, drafting a new set of proposals. She was reframing his ideas, translating his human logic into a language of strength and advantage that the Valerics Council could comprehend. They had become a seamless team. He was the unorthodox idea. She was the unimpeachable authority that gave it form and power. The blend was slowly, painstakingly changing the very foundations of her empire. Varel will still hate it, she said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. Let him, Clyde shrugged. He should be grateful. If you were still the queen I first met, you would have already sent the execution barges. Hersilia turned in her chair to face him, her dark eyes searching his. And in their depths, he saw his future. And if you were still the man I first met, you would have tried to pickpocket the councilman and stow away on a cargo freighter by now. He laughed, a real, easy sound. Probably, but I've got responsibilities now, a wife to keep happy, an empire to help run. It cuts into my thieving time. He grew serious, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Do you ever think about it, that day in the arena? Every day, she admitted, her voice soft. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. I stood on that balcony, watching you fight. You were not the strongest or the most skilled. By all our metrics, you should have been dead in minutes. But you refused to break. And then you looked up at me, not with fear, but with defiance. You made that ridiculous joke. It wasn't funny at the time, he confessed, especially when you said yes. I think my heart stopped for a full minute. I know, she said, her eyes opening again, a deep, warm light in them. I saw it on your face. But in that moment, I knew you were different. My father was bound by honor, and it got him killed. Vorlag used honor as a weapon to mask his corruption. Everyone in my court was playing the same rigid game. Then there was you, a man from another world who didn't even know the rules, and you chose to throw the whole game board in the air with a single insane wager. It was the boldest strategic move I had ever seen. I accepted the vow, not just as a political gambit, but because I suddenly had to know what would happen next. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the comfortable certainty of their shared life. It was a kiss that held the memory of their first desperate embrace, but was now tempered with the easy affection of husbands and wives, of partners and friends. So, it wasn't just my charming personality, he teased when they broke apart. That was a minor, secondary consideration, she replied, her tone perfectly regal, though the slight upward curve of her lips betrayed her. She stood and took his hand, leading him toward the great balcony adjoining the strategium. The twin suns were setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The sprawling capital below was alight with energy, peaceful and productive. It was a city that was changing, slowly learning that true power was not just the ability to conquer, but the wisdom to build. They stood there together, looking out at their shared future, a future that began with a joke shouted in the face of death. What started as his desperate bid for survival had become her quiet revolution. And for both of them, it had become a love that was redefining an empire.